Dad, could you tell me the ʔihikamu story?
ʔihikamu is the mucus that comes out of your nose, right? ʔihikamu. So it means made out of that mucus. And ʔihikamu is connected with like a scary character that we had in old stories. It's known as Pitch Woman. And I learned the story from my late uncle Simon Lucas. That's how I know the story the best. And in Heshquit territory, where he came from, the children would call Pitch Woman ʔihikamu. So that's the name that we use. But there's different versions of her name in different places. But in Heshquit, they call her ʔihikamu. So that's how I know her as. And Pitch Woman was a giant woman that was made out of pitch. And she lived deep in the forest a long time ago when humans were around a long time ago. And she was fond of stealing children to eat them. That's what she fed off of. And they say that the burls that you see on trees were children that were stored there from ʔihikamu, that she would store them there for snacks along her way home. And the way that she would usually find children is when it would be dark out, or it was children out in the, out on the land. And if they were crying, then she would hear them and start to draw closer usually. So people would say when a child's crying to make them stop crying, say, stop crying or ʔihikamu will come. But long time ago, ʔihikamu was a real person. And she was in her home that was far in the forest, and she could hear children crying one day. They were down on the beach, and I don't know what the parents were up to. They were busy. Maybe they were harvesting something, and you know how the whole community would come together, and all the mums and dads and aunties and uncles and even the grandparents, they'd all have to start to, maybe a whale or other things that came into the community, right? And it took all of their attention, and the children were left on their own down at the beach while the adults were all really busy doing whatever they were doing. And some of the children started to fight and to misbehave without their parents there, and one of the younger ones started to cry, and that's what the kids told them: you got to be quiet or else the ʔihikamu will hear you. But this little baby would just keep on crying and crying, and sure enough, the ʔihikamu came and she took all of those children, and she was a giant, and she had the basket on her back, and she'd pick them up and she'd put pitch on their face, on their eyes, and on their mouth, and then she'd put them into the basket that she had, and she scooped up all the kids while all the adults were busy, and she went off into the forest towards her home. Well, when the adults weren't as busy, they stopped and they noticed that the children were really quiet down at the beach, like if we were here and it was, all the kids were down the beach. They went to go see what was going on, and then they noticed that the children weren't there, and they started to look around for them, and they were all gone. They had all disappeared all at once. And of course, all of the adults, all the moms and dads and aunties and uncles and grandmas and grandpas, they were all really sad. And one of them was especially sad because it was the only child that she had. She was really, really, really sad. She was sitting at the beach and she kept crying and crying and crying. And so ʔihikamu is what we call it when you're crying and tears are coming from your eyes. ʔihikamu. You notice it's all I like that, right? At the beginning, the sound, it's all similar. ʔihikamu, ʔihikamu, and ʔintmis even has that kind of sound to it too, right? It's things that are kind of coming from your face, I guess, which is the meaning behind those words. So there was a mother, and it was her only child, and she was really, really sad. And she was sat at the beach, and she was weeping and crying, and tears and mucus were coming from her face the whole time that she was crying. And there was a shell that was on the beach, I guess, and as the tears and mucus were falling into it, after a while she started to notice that the mucus that built up in the shell started to move a little bit. And as she kept crying some more, and then she'd stop and she'd look, and it grew a little bit and started to look like a little tiny baby that was forming. And then after she kept weeping and crying, and it kept growing, and sure enough, it was like a newborn baby size. And she picked it up and she brought it up to her house and showed her husband, and it was like a spiritual gift that she received from while she was crying down at the beach. And this child grew really quickly. It wasn't like other children. It wasn't like a human being child. It was very gifted and could pick up things really quickly, walk and talk and do everything really fast. And that was ʔihikamu. And the parents, they loved him like it was their own child, but they were still really sad. And ʔihikamu, after he grew up really quickly, started to notice like he was like a older child really quick. And he started to notice that all of the parents were really sad. And he found out that all the kids were taken. And he found out the story about Pitch Woman, ʔihikamu, who came and took all the kids. And that's how he was born. So he felt that it must be his responsibility, his role to fix that. So he took it upon himself that he told his parents that he would track down ʔihikamu and get the children back. Remember, he aged really quickly, so time was going by, but he was growing really fast. Well, he started to get ready and prepared, and people kind of knew the direction of where Pitch Woman lived, but nobody wanted to go to her place. They were all scared of her. So it was easy enough to find, and there was the big burls and other things. You know what a burl is, right? It's the big growth on the side of a tree, right? And they just look like big balls that are attached to the tree. And so you could see those along the way to her house. And he followed a path, and he went deep into the forest, and eventually he came out, and there was like a little lake and a house next to it. And that was ʔihikamu's house. So he snuck up really close to it, and he looked inside, and sure enough, he could see ʔihikamu. She was in there. And there was a tree, a big tree that was outside of the house and near the lake too. And so he climbed up the tree, and ʔihikamu was inside, and all the kids were up on the wall. And one of the words that they use for ʔihikamu in other territories is ʔihikamu, which means like pitch on the walls. That's the name that some people use for her. And she would put the children up on the wall, I guess, and have them there ready to eat. So he came up with a plan, ʔihikamu, and he climbed up the tree, and he waited. He waited until ʔihikamu came out of her house. And when she did, she came to the water, and she went to go get some water to drink, but when she looked, she could see the reflection off the water. And ʔihikamu was way up on top of the tree, and he pretended to be her. He fooled her. And when she moved and saw her reflection in the water, he would move at the same time to make it look like it was her reflection. And she wondered to herself, how do I look so pretty? Because ʔihikamu was supposed to look really handsome, as a Snot boy. And so he was on top of the tree, and he kept mimicking all of her movements and convinced her that it was her shadow. She was really impressed with suddenly how she looked, because she always thought that she looked really ugly. But it was ʔihikamu's reflection that she was seeing. And then he jumped down and he startled her and he scared her. And then she was still really taken. She thought that he was a very handsome person, that he looked really nice, and she was envious. She wanted to be able to look really nice like how he did, and that's all that she could see. And so she asked him, how is it that you look so handsome? And he said, oh, you wouldn't understand. It was like the way that they did it, it was really complicated, and I don't think that you'd want to do it. And then she kept asking, and she was kind of pleading with him to find out how they made him look so pretty, how they made him look so handsome. But he was kind of tricking her and luring her along, right? And then finally he told her, okay, well, I'll let you know, but you can't tell anybody else. And you have to do everything that I tell you to do, because this is exactly how they did it to me, and that's why I look the way that I do. So she agreed, and she said, okay, I won't tell anybody else, and I'll do exactly what you tell me to do. So ʔihikamu, he told her to go find a big flat rock, a huge flat rock, the biggest one that she could find, and put it on the ground. So she did, and she went off, and she found this big, giant flat rock and placed it on the ground. He said, okay, that's perfect. Now I need you to go find a nice, big, heavy, round rock. So she did. She found a good, big, round rock that was really heavy. And then he told her, you have to lay down and you put your head down on the flat rock. And you close your eyes. And I'll pick up this big rock, and I'm going to tap it gently on your face. And when I do, you're going to turn pretty, just like I am. And she said, I don't know, are you sure? And he said, yeah, trust me, that's what I agreed with you. And so this is what you can't tell anybody else. this is the way that they did it to me, and that's why I look the way that I do. If you want to look this way, then this is what you have to do. So she agreed. She said, okay. So she laid down with her head down flat on the big rock that she put, and then ʔihikamu grabbed the big rock that she had, the big round one, and he was going to tap it on her face. But as he did it, he dropped it, and smush, her face was all mushy. And then he went running into the house, and you could see that the kids were up on the wall, and he started to take them down, and he found some oil, and he used the oil and he rubbed it on their eyes, and then they could see, and he took the pitch off of them. And as soon as he did, the kids that he was rescuing told him, you have to shoot her heart. She keeps it on the wall. So when she would go home, she would take out her ʔihikamu, her heart, and she would put it up on the wall. And sure enough, he looked up on the wall, and there it was beating, boom, 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 on the wall. And so he grabbed his bow and arrow that he had, and he shot the heart. It was on the wall, and that's how he killed ʔihikamu. And ʔihikamu was a scary character that used to steal children a long time ago. But then ʔihikamu came about, and he found a way to be able to get rid of her. And that's the story of ʔihikamu and ʔihikamu. But it goes on, the story goes on further, because ʔihikamu grows up really quickly, and he wants to go to where he comes from, which is the sky world, and he makes his way up there. And there's a whole other story that's connected after.
His heart
Oh, yeah.
was on like a stone wall. Like,
Oh.
don't you know, like what they used back in the day?
She kept her heart on the wall inside of her house. And maybe that's why he ish to it, pitch on the wall. Maybe that's what it refers to too, right? Could be. But the stone, the flat stone, is where she laid her head, and that's where ʔihikamu tricked her, because he wanted to smush her head, but then didn't realize that that wouldn't kill her.
The moral of the story.
The moral of the story is it can be different depending on different people who are listening or different stages of life. So if like you're a young child, the story may have a different meaning to you. Like the part that you might focus the most on is don't cry, or ʔihikamu is going to come to take you away. And it might be a way to just stop you from crying. But if you are older, or if you listen to the story many different times, you take different teachings away from it. And so the way that our oral stories, we call them ʔihikamu. The way that ʔihikamu works is that you hear it many different times throughout your life. And every time that you hear it, you might take something slightly different away from it. It's not always exactly the same. So the way that you hear the story compared to the way that your older sister hears the story, compared to the way that I hear the story, might all be slightly different. And we take different things away from it and different teachings away from it. And that's the way that our stories usually work.
Why is it important to memorize the stories?
The stories from our ancestors have many teachings, right? So we talked about how at different stages of life that you can learn different things or take different things away from it. So there's morals and teachings and values that we hold in the stories. It also connects us to our land and to our waters and to our territory in those ways. And the important thing is that it's a way of us being able to connect. So the way that in times past, with our ancestors, it would be grandparents and their grandchildren, and it would be grandpas and grandmas who would tell those stories to their grandchildren. And the grandchildren would grow up hearing those stories repeatedly over and over. And then eventually those grandchildren would grow up and become grandparents themselves, and they would tell the stories to their grandchildren. But there would be slight differences to it because of the way that we all hear the story slightly different. And then we add different things to it ourselves. So it's important to know the stories and to share the stories. Like sharing the stories is just as important, right, as knowing the stories. Knowing it is one thing, but it's the connection that we have, and this is the connection especially of our ancestors, of grandparents and grandchildren. And that's how hahupa, we teach each generation that comes along, and we help them to become stronger and better and healthier than we were.
What's the best way to memorize a story?
I guess the best way that I've learned to memorize stories or to be able to just know them is to listen regularly to the stories. And so I would hear the stories quite a few times And it's kind of rude actually if you tell elders that you already know that story or you've heard it before. But the other thing is to share it with other people right away, and to be able to tell the story in your own voice. Be able to tell the story in your own way of seeing it. And when you can share the story from your own perspective or your own way of viewing it, then it becomes your own too. And that's a good way for you to be a storyteller, is make it your own. And you have to bring it to life in your own way, whatever that might mean.
Why didn't I write down our stories? I love my eyebrows.
We didn't write stories before because we didn't have a written language for a long time, until just recently. Like in my lifetime, we had a written language like we know it today. And so we didn't really write down things. The way that we shared knowledge and teachings was from generation to generation, like this, sitting around a fire and talking to each other. And you would hear stories that were not just stories like what I shared with you about ʔihikamu, but you'd hear stories about your grandparents and something that they did and something they experienced in their life. And you'd hear all sorts of different stories. We call those ones ʔihikamu, and that's like stories that have to do with human beings. I mean, it also kind of means news or a story like that, right? Like human stories. So that was the important part, was we didn't write things down, we shared it. We spoke to one another, and we'd sit around a fire, or we'd sit in different spaces and share those stories with each other. Older generations sharing with younger generations. And that's how we pass knowledge down from generation to generation.